Welcome back to the debrief, produced by British Rowing in association with Junior Rowing News. It's take a breath time at the Tokyo Olympic Regatta, with severe weather warnings curtailing any hope of racing today or tomorrow. Nearly all crews now have tasted some form of action as the full spectrum of sporting emotion begins to reveal itself in the highs and then the lows of victory and irreversible defeat. Here on the debrief, this is Tom Morgan taking the reins from Fergus Mainland to guide you through the final days of racing. And I am delighted to be joined on this episode by Guin Batten, Olympic silver medalist in the women's quad in Sydney, Jess Eddy, seasoned veteran of this show and silver medalist in the women's 8 in Rio, and then Pete Lambert, Olympian in Rio in the men's quadruple sculls and returning to the debrief for the second time in 3 days. All of you have a wealth of experience in dealing with extraordinary pressure, but I would suggest, from my perspective, that this 2-day enforced break is not going to help the athletes. So Jess, if I come to you first, how do you think this is going to affect Team GB after, I think, what we'd fairly describe as a mixed bag of results over the past few days?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. But as rowers, we're in an outdoor sport, right? And all of these rowers at some point in their careers will have been interrupted by weather. Happened to us in Beijing. I raced to the start line. We were sitting on the start line and our race got cancelled. And we had to paddle down the course and wait until the next day until a storm came through. Happened in 2005 at the World Champs in Japan. There was a typhoon coming. So we're used to it. We're used to getting blown off. It's not ideal. And certainly with the mixed bag of results we've seen in the team, but they'll be able to cope with that. They're fine. They'll just have another day of kicking back, watching table tennis, okay? They'll be ready for it when it comes. And I think we're one of the best prep teams to be ready for it when it does happen.
And Pete, maybe coming to you next. How does one go about dealing with unexpected change? Now, I know you were the subject of an injury on the start line of a pretty major race once, and the crew had to swap around, and it was sort of very very ad hoc and spontaneous. How do you go about dealing with something that comes into the fray of a week that you planned so meticulously?
Yeah, that was in 2017 at World Champs in America, where my back went right before we were supposed to start. It also happened to us in Rio, where literally the weather changed the day of the final. We had our pre-paddle, we came in, and they told us that there was no racing that day. I think the biggest thing as well is that you need to do is you are prepared for anything. Jürgen used to say that he wanted to wake the athletes up at 3 a.m. and go and race, and everyone else had been known about that race day the whole time, and we would still be able to produce the best race. So I think it comes with the experience, and I think this is where, being in such a big team like GB, you are bound to have more times where it messes over and you have to adjust the times because there's such a big team. I think the smaller countries are so used to having tailored programs for them, they will almost be like, well, how do we handle this? Whereas GB, we've had this all the time. As Jess said, we always have to change weather times at Caversham all the time. So it's nothing new for us.
Well, it's comforting to know for anybody who was worrying about the 2 days off. So Guin, coming to you now, and welcome to the debrief. I suppose what I'd love to hear from you, and moving away from the weather, which obviously we can't control, and it sounds like GB have got it under control. What are some of the crews that you think we should be watching out for in the second half of the regatta? It's been, I think, a bit of a surprise to see some rise to the fore and some maybe not do as well. Who are the ones you've been watching quite closely?
Yeah, so I think really what we're moving almost from the point where you're racing to get into the final. We're starting to get situations now. I know we've still got a few semi-finals and reps left, but the majority of races are now moving into that section where you're racing for glory now. You're racing for everything. You've been training for 10 years of your life, and this matters. And this is, I think, is when the Olympic magic really starts to pick out. You know, I remember some of the races we watched just before our final in Sydney, and it was like people tore up the race book, you know, just the way they took the races out from 7:50 to go. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the crews that can now shift from that everything to lose, everything to gain. And really, you know, there's some front runners out here. I mean, it's really hard. It's absolutely open in quite a few of the events. But for me, you know, the one that I'm absolutely really excited to look at is the Chinese boat in the quads. You know, I think there's something in there that's going to come out. I mean, they are favorite coming in now. But yeah, to be honest, you know, I think it could come from anywhere. It could come from any of those events. That absolute magic, the crews that are prepared to tear up the rule book. I think it's going to be some exciting racing.
100%. And Jess, maybe let's flip back to you. It's been a tale of two halves on the women's sweep side, or let's say a tale of two halves in the 4 and the 8. The 4, I think, performing really well, and the 8 not so well. How are you looking at those two crews for Team GB?
Yeah, so I'll go to the 8 first. They were always up against it. The 8's field is got so much strength and depth this year. I mean, always has. I raced the games 3 times. It's a hard event, but those girls in our 8 are quite young. They're quite green to it, and they're racing against some crews that are coming into their prime. You've got the Americans who've come back into it, who haven't had a great Olympiad, the American women's there, but they're coming back into it, and they've shown that they won that heat. They won their heat, and they're straight in the final. So they've shown they've got the quality. You've got the Kiwis who are world champions with a pair that are doubling up. And if you want to watch how to row a boat, watch that Kiwi women's pair. They looked absolutely outstanding. They were so horizontal. I want to show junior rowers how to put the blade in the water, hang off it, and push the boat. And they're in their 8. And now they've got their job done. They've qualified the 8, so they don't have to worry about that. They can work on the pair now. It's a really, really deep field. And then you've got the Chinese women's 8 coming in. And they look very, very good. They took the race on. They didn't win their heat, but the Chinese women's 8 took the race on. So, yeah, our girls are really up against it coming into that rep. But I think, yeah, it's a tale of a few different stories happening. The Olympics are hard. And I think you can see how hard it is to get right, because it's not coming up to a World Cup. It's not coming up to a Euros. It's the Olympics, and crews have turned it on, and they've turned up, and they've peaked for this. You can see it in lots of. I think the Dutch crews are here, looking very sharp, very fast. You can see it in some of the Canadian boats. The Canadian women's 8 were very fast. The Kiwi pair women's fast. There was a very fast Aussie women's pair. So the women's sweep side up against it. But one thing to say is the women's 4, they absolutely turned on for that repechage. And from a disappointing heat where they got beaten by a few crews, they've obviously gone back to the drawing board and said, hold on, we're better than this. Let's remember how to row. And if you go back and watch the repechage, that Rebecca Shorten is stroking that 4 so well, so calm, so cool and clear-headed for her first ever Olympics, leading a repechage where it's, you know, it's cutthroat. If they didn't come top 2, they're out. And I think the class they showed in that rep, we could see something in the final. There's some very fast crews in the 4, absolutely, but I think they could be nipping on the heels of that podium.
And what about the pair? You spoke there about the Kiwi pair, how incredible they are. They're the world champions. They are the crew to beat. Helen Glover and Polly Swan obviously won't be listening to any of that. They'll have their heads down. They'll be focused on their race. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, the women's pair, so I don't think they had a great heat. Let's not beat around the bush. They came 3rd in their heat behind some crews. And I think for them to be on the podium, they're going to have to do what Guin was saying. And do you know what? Who could do that? Polly and Helen can do that. They can rip up that heat result and they could turn it on. And I think if they get a sniff of it and they get their bows ahead and they put the doubt in the minds of those around them, I still think we could see some fireworks from our women's pair. And I'd back them all the way. I think they've got a slightly easier semi, looking at the semis, with a fast Aussie and Canadian pair to race against, but they could be right up there. It's going to be them versus Denmark, possibly Ireland in the semi to get to that next step. And that's what they're concentrating on. They're not thinking about medals yet. They're thinking about getting to the A final.
And I think the other thing I wanted to touch on, and maybe coming to you, Pete, on this one was the form of the GB men's quad. Now, maybe I'd missed something in the run up to this, but I wasn't expecting fireworks from this crew. And actually they've delivered an incredible opening result. How do you think they managed to do that? They've almost come from nowhere.
No, they won a bronze at the last World Cup we attended. I think the thing what I was very happy about in the repechage is they did over Estonia. I think they were always going to be in the top 2, but Estonia had beaten them in both the races before that. So I think the fact that they went over there and beat Estonia was an important one. But I've been in that rep before where it's a top two and it is brutal. But I think the biggest thing that they did is they led from the start and the crews were chasing them back, but they just ran out of water. And that's exactly what they needed to do. I think exactly what everyone's speaking about is in the final, if you just go out and be brave, guys will freak out. Honestly, they'll freak out. Like Helen and Polly I still think Helen and Polly could win their semi if they went out and be brave, because like Helen's got the pedigree that they're like, oh my God, they're that far ahead. There's no way we'll catch him. That's Helen Glover that's that far ahead. Even though Helen's absolutely breathing through every bit of oxygen she can and she feels like she's going to blow up. They will freak out about that. And the quad have done really well. They're in an outside lane for the final. Let's just see what happens.
That's super interesting. Something I'd like to pick up on there. So how much of this is psychological? So we're at semi-final stages for a lot of events now. How much of a psychological blow can you actually pay your opponents if you win the semi going into the final with them?
I would say always Jürgen's crew, especially the men's four, we reckon that the GB men's four, the past 4 Olympics, have had half a length at the start, purely because they are Jürgen's crew and they're a men's four at an Olympic final. Because everyone knows his pedigree. Everyone knows that. That's going to be the same with the GB4 when they line up on Wednesday. Everyone knows the pedigree that four has. Everyone knows the prestige we've got in that event. And it's just like, whatever they do, they're going to be the GB4 at the Olympic final. It's amazing.
I think there's something about the second to last race that you do, and that can go both ways. You can either be in a situation where you dominate, play the game, and push the guys back so they feel that they can't beat you in the back of their head. Of course, everyone will believe that they can win the race. But then there's the other way around as well. Whereas you can, if you've got a crew behind you right on your tail for the whole part of the race, and you have to push yourselves very, very hard. I always used to think that if I was that crew behind, that the overriding memory they're going to have is of us coming onto them really hard in the dying phases of a race. So I think there's two ways. There is, you can overcook it and undercook it in the semi-final. And I think it depends a lot on belief. Now, the other thing that Spracklin always used to try and do, the race before the final, he would almost try in the last 250 and not need us, unless of course you have to get through to the round, but to make sure that you don't finish off your race. So your last memory of your race before you go into the final is a slightly more relaxed race and not a foot to the floor race. But different coaches, different times, different for many athletes. Just to make the final, they are going to have to, for many crews, going to have to put their foot to the floor to deliver it.
Yeah, I'd add that what I found quite fascinating is how you see the Dutch. Jess mentioned it, how the Dutch have timed it so well. World Cups, they were winning silvers, bronze. Suddenly now the Dutch team, men and women, are winning their semi-finals, winning their heats, breaking Olympic records. And you can just see that the head coach has got them all fired up perfectly in time for the Olympics. And you'll see that also. That's what's so interesting about the Australia and New Zealand. We haven't seen them the entire season. So they're coming here fired up, or they're not firing at all. So their men's single didn't make the AB semi. Their women's quad failed to make the A final. But then you've got Twig looking great. You've got the women's double that have lost for the first time in a while, yet their women's pairs looking strong, women's eights looking strong. So it just depends on how well they've taken that ramp up to the Olympics, because this will be by far the fittest they will ever be in the last 4 years, but this is also when they'll be the most rested in the last 4 years. So it's a very interesting time. You have to get your timing just right, that if you're too rested, you start falling off. But then if you train too much, you overcook it. So, and I think the Dutch have timed this perfectly well, the ramp up.
Absolutely. And I think there's also a really other interesting bit in the equation here. If you look into the women's quad, and you look at the Chinese went over in their heat at about 34 strokes per minute. And then you had the Poles that were 29 strokes. So it's going to be really interesting with them in that same race. Are the Poles going to modify that very high rate that they put in there, or were the Chinese cruising? It's really interesting. It's exactly what Pete's saying, is what is the journey during this week, and the athletes the crews that can actually keep progressing forward and keep moving on.
Yeah, my crews that I've been looking at outside of GB, obviously I think the Kiwi women's sweep team are looking so strong. I'm actually surprised by the Americans women's sweep team, because yes, their 8 won their heat. Their 4 was nowhere near, and their pair so far haven't. I know they had a dodgy start in their heat, but they were still only just got through in their rep. So I think the rest of the American women's team, the quad didn't qualify for the A final, have not been that strong. They've qualified every single women's boat, but they've not gone that fast in them apart from one. So that's kind of interesting to see. Irish men's double has fallen off out the back door. The Chinese men's double weren't as fast as they showed in that final race in Lucerne. Will they bring something to the final? So it's so interesting. This is almost the most fun to watch, because it's all the crews getting it right at the right time, and that's what makes it so hard. It's once every 4 years, or 5 years in this case, getting it right at the right time. And thank goodness it's not me anymore, because it's horrible. But it's them getting it right at the right time, and it's going to be really, really interesting to see. And just to touch on the 2 boats at the moment that are still got quite a few more races to go, I like women's double and Vicky Thorney in the single. I think both of them have got a mixed bag in their semis. I think both of them got some work to do and some progress to make. I think Vicky's got a really tough semi to get through to that A final, and I think we've got to keep all eyes on her to see what she can bring out in this, to see if she can put herself into that position and try and equal Guin's record and get that single into the final. So we've got some amazingly strong women's boats to look at to see how they're going to get on in the next couple of days.
It is absolutely fascinating. I think you've all touched on it there, to watch the new narratives unfold and almost watch new superpowers be born and old superpowers not regress, but become almost less relevant on the grandest stage. And perhaps the Dutch and their perfectly timed surge towards the finish line is a clear example of how they're becoming, one of the big European rowing superpowers. But Guin, actually, I'd love to flick back, and this is a little bit off topic perhaps, but seeing as you are here, and I know that you're a bastion of coastal rowing knowledge, we can't ignore the fact that coastal rowing is becoming more and more, important and pertinent to the sort of wider sporting ecosystem. And what I wanted to get your very quick thoughts on coastal rowing at the Olympics, and particularly in LA. How are you thinking about that? Are you excited for that? Do you think that's going to provide a totally different dynamic for people to get involved with the sport of rowing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the real bits around the coastal side was very much in the direction the IOC were looking at taking sports in general. And there is a real narrative around coastal being favorable to countries that have opportunities to host world championships because they're so much smaller. So it's very much targeted in many ways about trying to bring different sides of our community to come together. Small island nations that predominantly don't have access to 2,000 meter flat water, and how can they come to play? I mean, as to what it might be in LA, we've as a sport, we've very much positioned it as coastal rowing, and being able to take that added value into the Olympic program, and trying to keep it really agile. Trying to keep it agile so that the formats or the locations, we can share those with other sports. We can be adaptable to the environment we're in as to whether or not it's sprints or endurance. So, it's exciting. I think it's one of those things that's almost a foil to what is brilliantly exciting and amazing at the Olympics, which is the amazingly trained, the incredible, Formula One type approach that we do to 2,000 meter racing, and to the other side of it, the chaos, the jeopardy, the agility of the waves and the outdoor, etc. I mean, you know, we've got surfing at Tokyo, and of course they're going, bring on the big swell, bring on the cyclones or typhoons, etc. You know, and of course, you know, surfing is a hugely outdoor sport. Stephanie Gilmore, the favorite, went out yesterday, you know, and I think sometimes flat water rowing is quite predictable. In many ways, often the favorites do come through, despite the fact that we're sitting here going that there is quite a lot of changes going in the next few days. But if you introduce sports like coastal rowing, you know, incredibly open and very, very unpredictable. So it's exciting. If it gets into the Olympics, brilliant. If it doesn't, it's a discipline in its own right with a community of people that are absolutely embedded in it and love doing it. So it's a win-win for everybody at this stage in the game.
I think that's something we have to remember at the Olympics. Everyone likes to think we should be the same and the same things happen. Not true. Since 1896, the games change and evolve every Olympiad, and that's the nature of the modern Olympic Games. We don't play tug of war anymore. We don't have gold medals for art and architecture anymore. Bring them back. You know, the games change and they evolve. And if anyone's watching the skateboarding, it's awesome. If anyone's watching the 3-on-3 basketball, it's amazing. And we have to be open-minded that our sport will change, and it has to adapt and evolve for it to be included in the games still. So I think as a sport, if we can be open to that and excited about it and give it an avenue, we'll see it thrive. So I completely agree with Guin.
100%. And I'm personally very curious to watch the evolution of coastal rowing, and you're right, Jess, on how our sport changes with that. But let's look to wrap this particular debrief up, and I'd love to get all of your sort of quick fire thoughts, and maybe Jess, seeing as you spoke last, let's have your opinion first. If you were to sort of give GB rowing, Team GB, a ranking out of 10, and how they're going to be feeling going into the next few days of racing, what number would you give that?
What, of confidence, or how nervous they're going to be?
Let's say, how happy are they on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being, you know, completely devastated, and 10 being as happy as could be.
I think it's probably a bit of a mix. I think everyone's probably a bit gutted about the women's quad. I think they were kind of a standout crew. I think they'll probably be somewhere about a 7.5. I would say I think our men's are going to win. I think they're going to come back and dominate the event. I think they had a shocker, and I think their start got messed up, and I think they're going to come back and win. So we're going to see them doing well, and we're going to see some medals come, and that's going to give us confidence. So they know the program. They've done the training. They've done the hard stuff. They've got to have confidence in what they've done and the medals they've already won. And don't get me wrong, it does take a blow when crews don't make the A finals. So I think that hopefully the crews are concentrating on themselves, but really drawing on the good stuff and ignoring the bad stuff. So I'd say it's going to be nervous, but I'm confident we can still go out there and dominate some of these events.
Pete, what's your number?
I was going to say 6.5. I think the men's eights will, I agree, need to win their rep, but they will win the rep. But I think they need to do that. Once that goes in, it will be 8, because I think they'll smash the rep. They'll absolutely dominate the final, but they need to do that. And I think that's where, once that gets done, everyone breathes a sigh of relief and they're like, okay, we're back on track. I do agree the heat, they mess it up, but I would say 6.5 at the moment, because of the fact that the 8 isn't in the final. But as soon as they suddenly put a length or half a length on everyone in the rep, then it's like, oh, right, everyone else was like that, and GB are now suddenly a half a length up of everyone. Oh, they're back to where they need to be.
And Guin, round us off. What's your reflection?
Yeah, okay. So 2 things I want to leave us with. As they get into those last minutes and those last warm-up sessions and they come onto that line, it has to be a 10 in their head. And really, who are they competing against? They're just competing against themselves. Can they get within 10 strokes of that finish line and have absolutely nothing left? Have their whole body closing down on them, not being able to hear anything or see anything? You know, can they get to that point? And it's really scary just trying to get to that place. they have to have a 10 in terms of their concentration. And I guess what I really want to leave today, and I feel so much for women's sport, you know, I fundamentally believe that they were so close to achieving and making that final, and you know, going out there and doing incredibly well and winning a medal. And I just think that their experience over this camp, with this Olympics, will fuel the fire for at least another 4 years. And I wouldn't put it past that these guys absolutely surpass themselves. Each individually, in the journey they'll go through in the next 4 years will be defined by what happened over this week in Tokyo, and they will become better athletes for it, because the mountains are only high when the valleys are deep, and they are deep in a valley.
That's a wonderful reflection to leave us on, Guin. And I appreciate all of your time, Guin, Pete, and Jess, for appearing on the debrief. That's everything from us for this particular episode, but tune back in Wednesday morning. We'll have our live reaction to the racing that is yet to come. But for now, thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you all Wednesday morning.